I'm very pleased to introduce to you Eric Mack, who is going to be speaking on F.A. Hayek and his view of society and law. Eric is a professor of philosophy at Tulane University. He teaches at Newcomb College, the undergraduate college there, and also in the Murphy Institute of Political Economy, which is an interdisciplinary program. He specializes in ethics, politics, philosophy of law, among other topics. He has edited books of essays by historical writers, including one on Herbert Spencer, and has published something on the order of 70 articles in professional journals of philosophy and other fields. A very prolific record, I might say. Eric has been involved in the academic world, teaching and writing about the philosophy of freedom and libertarianism for quite a while now. In the 1970s, a point of interest for us at the center, he taught at Eisenhower College in New York with George Walsh, who many of you know and who is a trustee of our organization. Kind of a funny story about that George was a professor there, and Eric was a young scholar out of graduate school. And the higher up wanted a Marxist in the philosophy department, and George Walsh, who was there and who wanted to bring Eric in, managed to, I think I can say without actually lying, give the impression that Eric was a Marxist. The beard helped. As did his knowledge of Marx, which was probably deeper and more systematic than that of most Marxists. Eric is also president, as we mentioned in the opening lecture at this conference, president of the Louisiana Association of Scholars, which is the state chapter of the National Association of Scholars, and he has himself been involved in some political correctness battles at Tulane. He's also active in Liberty Fund conferences. Liberty Fund is an organization that sponsors scholarly get-togethers of people from different fields and different points of view to thrash out issues. For those of you who are interested in pursuing a scholarly career, it's a very interesting way to get into a universe of interesting people and prominent scholars. Over the years, I've locked horns with Eric on many issues in technical philosophy, but I want to say that Eric has been a tireless scholar in his own right and a tireless supporter of younger scholars, constantly networking, constantly looking for opportunities to expand the freedom for those who take our point of view, broadly speaking, in academic life. He made his start at a time, and I remember it very well, in the 70s when to be in philosophy and to be a libertarian, you were automatically a pariah of the worst kind, especially if you were writing on politics. And Eric is one of the people who has changed that and made it much more possible, although still difficult, for those who are entering academic life today from that standpoint. So I'm especially happy to have Eric here today to talk about one of the main contributors to libertarian classical liberal thought in our own era, F.A. Hayek.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Quite fittingly, this lecture about F.A. Hayek has evolved a bit since the moment in which I wrote the outline that you have in your binder. So if you want to do so, you don't have to fill this right in on that outline, but imagine at the bottom of that page, there's a Roman number 4, and next to it, it says, "Are the rules of just conduct justified?" And this will be some of the main issues I'll talk about in that last section of the lecture, which will consist of the last 5 or 7 minutes or so, I hope, of the lecture. I also have to remind you that evolution always increases complexity. So be prepared when I get to this section of the lecture to have the portion that is probably the most intellectually complex of the talk. As you see on the binder, if you're looking at that, the first section of my talk is entitled Better Political Philosophy Through Social Science. I want to talk about some of the deep insights of F.A. Hayek about the nature of social order and law. For most of this lecture, I'll focus on core Hayekian teachings, which are entirely consistent with and, importantly, complementary to the objectivist worldview. Along the way, I'll also discuss Hayek's views about the power or lack of power of conscious reason. And here we'll be looking at some views of Hayek which are not obviously consistent with all of objectivist views. Some of the places where Hayek is not consistent, he may be wrong, and I'll invite you to think about whether he might be right about some of these other matters. So we'll look about issues of the power of conscious reason, and I'll conclude with a discussion about whether or not Hayek, by way of conscious reason, can justify the rules of just conduct, which is his name for the most basic moral principles on which a free society rests. Hayek, who, it's fitting to mention, always referred to himself as an old Whig, in the sense of the Whig tradition that David was talking about, David Mayer, the other day, was born in 1899, and he died in 1992. If physical survival is the standard of value, Hayek is right up there. He was one of the great figures in Austrian economics. He was an extraordinarily prolific writer in theoretical and applied economics, in the philosophy of social sciences, in history, and in social and legal theory. His technical writings were mostly composed in the 1930s, and if there's anybody here, and I'm sure there is, who's familiar with that work, that person is infinitely more knowledgeable than I am. In the 1930s and 40s, Hayek published a series of papers basically expanding on arguments originally given, maybe not quite originally, by Ludwig von Mises against the possibility of rational socialist planning. More generally, Hayek argued that the chief virtue of an economic system is not simply to facilitate people being able to act on already existing knowledge, but to facilitate the production of new knowledge that people need in order to act rationally. And we'll see that throughout Hayek, a crucial theme, and in a way this is interestingly overlaps with objectivist sorts of themes. A crucial theme is the role of knowledge and the importance of knowledge for success in human life, and therefore the importance of having institutions that promote the generation of knowledge and that allow people to act on the knowledge that they acquire. In 1944, Hayek published The Road to Serfdom, which actually earned him the ire of Ayn Rand in some letters that she wrote. But actually, contrary to Rand's prediction, this work did not encourage the growth of socialism, but was one of the important factors in at least slowing and perhaps reversing the growth of socialism in the West. In later years, Hayek turned even more to questions of social and political theory, legal theory, and briefly his main works are The Constitution of Liberty, 1960, the 3-volume Law, Legislation, and Liberty, 1973, 76, and 79, which I consider the high point of Hayek's work, and The Fatal Conceit, 1988, where some of the, what you might suspect as irrationalist tendencies in Hayek come, we might say, to full bloom, unfortunately. As I said, the great book in my mind is Law, Legislation, and Liberty, and the ideas I'll be talking about in Hayek are, I think, best expressed in the first volume of that work. So if you want the best of Hayek from the horse's mouth, go to Law, Legislation, and Liberty, Volume 1. Hayek was no objectivist, and as I mentioned, to put it mildly, Ayn Rand was not much of a fan of Hayek's. Nevertheless, and I feel a little silly saying nevertheless, nevertheless, Hayek made an enormous contribution to the understanding and defense of the free society. As I said, a contribution which complements, in large part, objectivist insights. What I want to do is say why there's room for this complementarity, right? And as I do that, say something about the space in which, the intellectual space in which Hayek is operating. Roughly speaking, objectivist thinking makes two major contributions to the defense of the free society. One is to develop a theory of rights, as other people in the past and maybe in the present have done, which provide a legal framework for the free society. The other thing that objectivism does, which is more distinctive, is it celebrates people's exercising the freedoms that they would have under a regime of rights. It's not just that people should have these rights, but it's a good thing that people enjoy and prosper under the exercise of those rights. Both of those are contributions to the normative case for the free society. Right? Both of those are contributions of moral and political philosophy to the defense of the free society. The difference in Hayek is that Hayek is concerned about non-normative questions. He says, what I'm interested in is understanding what the nature of social order is. I'm interested in understanding what the nature of law is. If you think back, I think just for a second, about sort of the objectivist literature, you don't, I think, have many essays, the title of which is The Nature of Social Order, right? Or The Nature of Law, right? That's not a topic that has characteristically been addressed. And in any case, notice it's not a normative question. Hayek is interested in saying, how can we understand what the actual nature of different types of social order are? How can we understand what law is, or what different types of law could exist within different types of social order? And his view is that if we get clear about that, we will in fact have provided a great deal of defense for the free society. The reason he thinks that's true is that he thinks that, and this is the full-fledged version within Hayek I'll mention, he thinks that people's dissatisfaction with the free society is not based upon bad moral views that they have. He thinks it's based entirely on their being confused about the true nature of social order and the true nature of law. So Hayek thinks that he can bypass the question of what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, what is just and unjust, because that's not the area where the real problem lies. The real problem lies in the fact that people are confused about what the nature of economic order is, what the nature of social order is, what the nature of legal order is. And it's this confusion that leads them to bad political conclusions. Hayek's view is, I can cut these people off at the pass before I even have to enter the moral debate. Hayek believes this partially because he comes out of an intellectual tradition which said, well, issues of social science are subject to rational resolution. If we have a scientific debate, then we can engage in a sort of rational dispute and come up with what are acknowledged to be rational answers. But in contrast, this is the tradition he's coming out of, in contrast to scientific debates, there are these debates about right and wrong and good and bad, and these really can never be resolved. These are not genuinely scientific issues. And therefore, if you really want to nail somebody, right, you can't nail them on their moral views, and it's not really moral views that move the world, it's these views about how the world is. It's the views about the nature of reality outside of moral issues that are really important, and Hayek thinks that if only I can show people right, how the world really works, right, then they'll come over to my side. Is this view correct? No. Right? Think about, I'm going to refer to these people again later on, but think about the folks who were inspired by the ideas in late 19th century Germany and early 20th century Germany that Steve Hicks talked about the other day. Oh, the glories of sort of tribal immersion. Oh, the glories of killing people. Oh, the glory of being killed yourself, at least while you're fighting for the glory and the well-being of the Kaiser, right? Well, the problem with those folks, right, was not that they misunderstood the nature of social order or did not say, right? They had really bad moral values, right? But nevertheless, and it's sort of interesting point, Hayek has to try to sort of tend to push aside the vision of those people, right? He wants to say, well, people are really mostly very reasonable. People have sort of very reasonable values. They have nice bourgeois values, right? People want comfort, they want security, they want peace, they want tolerance. And what I can show them is that if they think they're going to get it out of socialism, they're wrong, right? He has to push aside these horror cases. Now, I think that Hayek, although wrong about the belief that all error in political and legal conclusions comes from error about the way your thoughts about how the world works, although he's wrong to think that this is true always, he is right to think that it's often the case. Very often, people's unfortunate political views are not based upon their having the wrong theory of rights, right? They're believing that these are the rights, right? People have unfortunate political views very often because they don't understand what social order is. They don't understand what the conditions of economic order are. They don't understand what a legal system might look like. They have a misconception of what the law has to be. For instance, they assume that in order for there to be law, as I'll be talking about in more detail, they assume that in order for there to be law, there has to be some unchallengeable authority whose word is the final word, right? And that leads them to certain unfortunate political conclusions. Right? So Hayek's work speaks very directly to people whose unfortunate political conclusions are not the product of really unfortunate moral views, but are the product of confusions about the nature of social order and the nature of legal order. And this will be spelled out as I move along. Here's an example of the sort of thinking that I was referring to. When I first went to Tulane, which was a while back now, I remember going to a talk by a fellow who was an advocate of communalist anarchism. So he thought that the ideal world would be a world of small communities, and within these communities people would care a lot about each other, and they'd spend a lot of time discussing what should be done, and they'd engage in a lot of cooperation, and they'd work very hard to sustain this sort of decentralized anarchist world. He said very little about what the relationships between these communities would be like, but he did say, well, there won't be any large, powerful central state that will govern over these different communities. Okay. Someone in the political science department at Tulane, after the talk was over, gets up very florid, with great rhetorical flourish. She goes, well, this is nonsense. Because look, what happens if these communities want to build a road? Well, one community's road will go here, and the other community's road will go up here, and the roads will never meet, right? And she just sat down. That was it. That was absolutely decisive, right? Which is why, of course, also all the roads from the United States that come to the Canadian border just dead end at the border, right? The ones from Canada just dead end. Okay. So what was going on in this woman's mind? I mean, there was some sort of a premise, an incredibly powerful premise, right, that was operating in her mind, which blinded her to the obvious fact, right, that two independent agencies, whether you like the particular agency or not, are quite capable of coordinating their behavior one with the other, right? And what blinded her to that was the idea that, very, very common idea, that coordination among human beings will only occur, or will only occur in any sort of reliable or stable way if there is some entity in charge, if there is some authority, right, who will be able to tell people what their problem is and how they should go about solving it. So there had to be a sort of, in her vision, there had to be somebody who would identify the transportation crisis between this community and would survey what resources the two communities had for dealing with the crisis, right? And would figure out what the plan should be and who should play what role in carrying out the plan and issue the instructions and perhaps punish people who didn't follow the instructions. God damn it, that's what you have to have if you're going to have order, in this case, with respect to transportation between the communities. Okay. Why would somebody believe this sort of thing? I do want to talk a little bit about why someone might believe this. And it's interesting because this resonates with all different other sorts of issues. If we had more time, we could talk about how the argument from design for the existence of God comes in here and in all sorts of wonderful ways. But let's pick a particular example. Someone might reason like this. Well, any complex system is made up of lots of parts, right? That's a condition of its being a complex system. And if there are many parts, there are, of course, many, many different ways in which those parts can be related to one another. Of those many, many different ways in which the parts can be related to one another, clearly only one or a few of those ways is going to generate stable order among those parts, right? So my watch has lots of parts, and there are lots and lots of different ways in which the parts could be related to one another, right? Suppose those parts exist, right? And instead of they're just lying around, lo and behold, they're all related to one another so that an order exists, right? The parts work with one another in a stable and ongoing way. How could such a thing be possible? Well, I referred briefly to this design argument for the existence of God. People argued in the 18th century. It wasn't such a crazy argument. Look, if you were wandering along, let's say, on the surface of Mars, and you came across a nice watch, right? What would you say? Well, you say, well, this couldn't be the product of chance, right? It must be that the fact that the parts are coordinated in this particular way, that this order exists, that is evidence that somebody must have planned it. Somebody must have designed it, right? And the order of the universe, these people argued, was evidence that there must be a God. How else, except by pure chance, which would be unreliable, could order be maintained when the possibilities for disorder are so great? Okay. I have a couple of other examples, but I think I have to move, not use them all. Use one more example. Here's another case. There is of why someone might think that you need this type of design and imposed structure in order to have rational order. Okay, here we're talking about an order which is primarily composed of people. There's an army at war, right? I'm the commanding general of the army, right? I want to have a rational plan, right? I want to destroy the opposing army. Well, what do I have to do? I have to figure out, well, where are all my troops? Where are all my weapons? Where is all my fuel? I may not do this directly myself. I have some underlings helping me out. And if I'm going to proceed rationally, what I have to do is draw up the best possible plan of battle. I have to know where each resource should be allocated so that its use there, including primarily people, combined with the use that I have decided upon for each other military resource I have, which are the other people, I have to come up with a plan where the totality of these uses, which I tell people they have to engage in, adds up to, right, the best plan of battle. The plan of battle that is most likely to destroy the enemy. I have this purpose, and I have to order the material that is available to me so as to maximize the chances of achieving that purpose. And that's what a rational general would do. That's what a rational battle plan would be. It would be designed, it would be planned. I don't tell people, oh, you know, just sort of go out and do what you feel like, right? And if privates say, well, I want to exercise my own individual judgment about whether I should fight here or fight there, you go, you don't have the big picture. You don't see how everything has to be coordinated. Everything has to have this fundamentally centrally directed coordination for there to be a chance for the battle plan to be rational. Okay. The conclusion of this line of thought, right? Not a line of thought I'm trying to convince you of, right? But make you aware of, and see why there's a certain, one could be seduced to some extent by this line of thought. The conclusion of the line of thought is that human relationships, that if human rationalities have sway in the social world, society itself must be organized according to a conscious plan directed at achieving society's purpose. Society must become a rational organization. Any other sort of social order or disorder is an affront to reason. It would be irrational for the social world not to be organized, not to be designed. Reason demands that we achieve an organized, designed, engineered social world. The idea that we have to have this type of design, of course, is behind more particular beliefs that, for instance, you can't have a smoothly working economic order unless you have economic planning, or that you can't have a satisfactory medical system in which medical services are produced and other people consume it unless somebody figures out how it should be and designs it and institutes it. So this idea percolates down as justification in people's minds for why there has to be planning, why there has to be a plan, a 5-year plan, a 7-year plan for anything if things are going to go well. Hayek is the 20th century's most tenacious critic of this identification of a rational social order with a planned or designed social order. That, in a way, is his great claim to fame. Hayek both attacks the idea of a designed order as desirable and offers an alternative to it. The alternative is usually referred to as spontaneous order. Society as a spontaneous order. Not an entirely felicitous phrase because it suggests just poof, it comes into existence. It doesn't mean that. Okay. The attack first, a word or two about the attack, and then a little bit more about the positive case for this alternative. Hayek attacks the idea of the designed order using a vocabulary which you may be a little bit uncomfortable with, but don't worry about that per se. Okay? Hayek says that the belief that a rational social order has to be designed is the product of two conceits of reason. It's the product of a type of over-ambitious view about the powers of reason. Okay? Here are the two conceits. One is that reason can identify what the purpose of society as a whole is. Because notice, if you're going to have a designed order, it has to be predicated on the idea that there's a purpose for that order. The army has a purpose, destroying the enemy. right? Recall some of the other examples I didn't get to use. Wherever there seems to be a case for designed order, it has to be premised on the idea that the collection of components that you're focusing on have a common purpose and ought to be devoted to that purpose. Right? So Hayek says, look, the first thing that's wrong with this designed order story is it presupposes that there is a known purpose for society, that reason can identify such a thing. But there isn't any such thing, or at least reason can't identify it. There is no known purpose for society, and therefore there is nothing for a designer to design for or toward. That's the first conceit of reason that is involved in the idea of a designed society. The second problem, which Hayek would also describe as a conceit of reason, is the belief that, well, at least if somebody knew what this purpose of society was, then that person could figure out how to arrange all the parts to successfully promote that purpose. Right? Hayek says, no one could engage in that process either. No one, even if they knew what the purpose of society is, and there really isn't any purpose for society as a whole, but even if they knew what the purpose was, they couldn't go on to know how to arrange all the parts so as to effectively serve that purpose. The belief that we're clever enough to do that, or the belief that a central planner could be in position to have the knowledge to do that, is another conceit of reason. If you don't like the phrase conceit of reason, just wherever I say it, substitute. Hayek points out that there isn't any such knowledge available to people, right? Okay. A general theme of Hayek, which I don't want to sort of push too far out of the way, although it's not my central interest, is that there's a certain type of tendency that people have to overestimate the power of reason, right? To expect to overestimate the power of reason. And so he's interested in using these phrases like the conceit of reason to try to make people more aware of what he thinks of as the inherent limits of what we can expect to be able to know and do. Okay. What's the positive case for the spontaneous order? Well, let's see. Positive case, let's first give a couple of quick examples, right? The obvious example, which is not a social order, right? A non-social spontaneous order, would be something like an ecological system, right? In an ecological system, there's an incredibly complicated order. There are incredibly complicated relationships between the different components, the flora and the fauna within the system, whichever of those mean what, I never remember. But it's not the result of any design. What is it the result of? It's a result of the fact that the components of the system are capable of adjusting themselves or their behavior to the other components of the system. Either particular components adjust their own behavior, or their ancestors who didn't adjust their behavior are gone, right? So there are processes of adjustment and processes of selection which account for how there becomes to be a coordination among the parts of the system, a coordination which is not at all the product of anybody's design. Similarly, in the case of the sort of economic order that arises within a sort of free market, private property context. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, each adjusts his behavior to what he takes to be the interests and the desires of the other. Right? That adjustment, the crucial element is that the particular elements of the system are able to adjust their behavior, or they are at least able to pick up and imitate the adjustments of behavior that other people have initiated. Right? Because of that, people are able to form coherent, cooperative units which are not the product of anybody else's design. Each person indeed often intends to perform a particular action. Right? The baker intends to produce nicer or more scrumptious pastry because he knows he can sell it to the candlestick maker and the butcher. The butcher intends, of course, to produce better, more luscious cuts of meat, which he's able to deliver before they spoil. So people have all these particular intentions based upon their particular knowledge and based upon their desire to coordinate their behavior with people who are around them. But all of that produces a joint, coordinated system, which is, as a whole, is nobody's design and reflects nobody's overall purpose. The overall economic system, just like the ecological order, has no purpose of its own. The components of the system have their own purposes, and in fact, the system is able to emerge and develop precisely because the individual components are allowed to act on their own purposes, are allowed to act in accord with what Adam Smith calls their own principles of motion, and do not have external foreign principles of motion imposed upon them. So, for instance, the baker is not required out of love for the butcher to produce these better pastries. Right? His actions, his adjustment, and the possibilities of his adjustment to the desires of the butcher and the candlestick maker are consistent with his own principle of motion, which is to advance his interest. Right? I want to advance my interest, but within the context of a free market private property system, the way to do that is to produce ever more luscious, ever more scrumptious pastries, right? So internal coordination of the parts is the secret to spontaneous order, whether it be non-human spontaneous order or a human spontaneous order. Got remarkably away from my written text, which is good, I guess. The thing I want to emphasize, which I haven't yet, is that for Hayek, the crucial reason why spontaneous orders work better than designed orders is that they allow a much greater, much more extensive use of human knowledge. The reason for this is that the vast majority of practical human knowledge about how to do things, what would be a good thing to do, what would be kind of a mistake because things may get all screwed up, the vast majority of practical human knowledge is highly particular. Each of us knows a bunch of very particular things about, for instance, one's own skills or one's own possible skills if only one tries to develop them in certain ways, or one's own local, what the desires or interests of the people around us are, or what resources may be available. So I have some idea of where some resources are that you don't know about, and you know about some resources that I don't know about. The vast majority of our practical knowledge is local and scattered in this way. A great deal of it is not even expressed by us or articulated by us. It's tacit, it's in the form of hunches, it's in the form of know-how. Human well-being depends upon the effective use of human knowledge. This scattered, private, local, tacit knowledge, according to Hayek, and this is also an argument that comes from, to some extent, from Mises, cannot possibly be made use of in any central plan or design. The central planner can't have this knowledge. And I'm not even talking about the other issue about the central planner can't have the knowledge that one gains through prices because he's eliminated prices. That's a separate issue. The central planner can't know what particular people know. Right? What we need is a system, a social system, which as much as possible allows people to exercise, to operate, to make use of the highly individual, particular knowledge that they have of their own capacities, opportunities, and circumstances. How do you have such a system? You have such a system by, you have such a system if you have rules which tell people that they can, through their own, based on their own best judgment, utilize their own talents and their own resources for the sake of their own chosen ends. Right? So we say to people, you don't have to wait to get everybody else's approval that you have a good idea here. You don't have to wait to get other people's approval before you pursue some particular end that you have. You don't have to get other people's approval before you engage in what generally we can agree is a sort of risky economic action. What we want is people to be assured that they can act on their own judgment about their own particular talents, interests, preferences, capacities, and circumstances. And the only way to ensure people of that, right, is to tell people, in effect, you have rights. You have a right over yourself. You have a right over your talent. You have a right over the resources that you've acquired in a certain particular way. If you have a hunch about a good way to use some other resource, well, it's possible for you to go out and purchase that resource. So we have the possibility of transfer of resources. A system which assigns those rights is the only system which is going to unleash, or is the only system which is going to deliver the benefits of people acting on the vast amount of knowledge that they have. And simultaneously, of course, such a system is beneficial for other people as well, right? Because the system is one in which, although I can exercise rights over myself and my property and my own talents, I can't exercise rights over you. You have been assigned rights to yourself and your talents and so on, so that you can, if you choose, utilize your own best judgment about what your ends are and what your talents are and what your circumstances are. So the way to have a spontaneous social order is to have what Hayek calls rules of just conduct. I guess I can't write it too many times. And rules of just conduct, as I said, take this form of the assignment of inviolable or almost inviolable domains to each particular person. We can have a world in which each person pursues their own freely chosen ends on the basis of their own best judgment about how those ends can be attained. We can have such a world without collisions, only by having clearly demarcated property rights and personal rights, one person to another. Okay. That's the necessary condition of a spontaneous social order. Okay. I'm really way behind. I want to talk about not just designed order versus spontaneous order, but two different conceptions of law. The command conception of law versus, well, the rules of just conduct conception of law. Okay. Hayek says people not only have the wrong conception of social order, they also have the wrong conception of law. And they have the wrong conception of law largely because they have the wrong conception of social order. What any social order requires law, right? And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily billy clubs, something more general. Social order requires that there be some rules that people habitually abide by. Okay? What type of law does social order require? Well, it depends on what you think social order is. If you think social order is designed order, then you are naturally led to the following image of law. Law is a set of commands that emanates from some central authority and tells people in as much detail as possible what they ought to do to achieve that authority's purpose. Right? If you believe that social order is designed, then you naturally adopt what people often call the command theory of law. You say, well, what are the rules that make a designed order work? Well, the rules that make a designed order work are exactly like in the army. There are a bunch of commands, instructions, directives, which come from the central authority who knows what the big picture is and tells people in particular how they ought to live their lives. Ed the other day was talking about these regulations which told banks to do, and he said very nicely what these regulations do is they deputize these bank clerks, making them do the government's business, where the government's business is the pursuit of whatever crazy purpose the government thinks it has, right? Well, if you believe that society is a designed order, you ought to believe that what law is the systematic deputization of every member of the society as much as possible, right? And you believe that not because you say, oh, that's good law. You just say, well, what else could law be, right? If we're going to have law, we have to have this imposed set of rules that tells each person what they should do as part of a imposed coordination, right? Just as you can't have a good organized army without commands, you can't have a good organized society without laws understood as commands in this way. Right? Won't go into it, but Hayek does a very nice thing about how this conception of law is completely antithetical to the whole ideal of the rule of law. Because on this conception of law, each particular person is subject to, in theory, completely separate rules. Right? I should act in this way, other people should act in this way. What everyone ought to do is simply the particular activities which best dovetails in the minds of the leader with everyone else's particular activities so as to produce the desired outcome. Hayek has a number of criticisms of this conception of law, but the most straightforward and elegant is, well, yeah, if you have a designed social order, that's what you're going to have is the law. But we don't want a designed social order. We want a spontaneous social order. And the type of law that is necessary for a spontaneous social order is radically different from the type of law that is necessary for a designed social order. What type of law is necessary for a spontaneous social order? Well, actually, I've already, in a way, have jumped ahead and told you that. Law that defines particular people's domains so that everybody knows where and when and how they can exercise and act on the basis of their knowledge and their judgment about what ends they want to pursue and what means they want to employ in the pursuit of those ends. Rules that guarantee everybody the right to do that within their protected domain, to alter through mutual consent the boundaries of those domains, but not to pursue their ends by way of invasion into other people's domains. Okay? Those are the rules of just conduct. The rules of just conduct are rules like don't kill innocent people, don't seize their stuff, slightly more complicated, comply with your contracts, make up, if you've accidentally injured somebody, make compensation. These are the basic rules of just conduct. How far do I, was that? Okay, I'm not, that's right on the border whether I can go on to, okay. One quick comment on these things and then I'll try to push on to the last section. For those of you, and even if you aren't already familiar with those terms, it's sort of nice There's a common distinction in law between so-called private law and public law, right? Public law is really basically administrative law, right? Private law is things like the law of torts, law of accidents, law of property, contract law. It's the law that governs the proper modes of relationship between individuals, right? And tells us when one individual has an action against the other because of the first's misbehavior. Hayek's view is that in addition to tort law and contract and property, criminal law should even, contrary to the usual listings, should be up here. All of these things simply specify the acceptable versus the unacceptable modes of interaction among individuals. Hayek's claim is private law is the real law. That's what law is, right? And all this stuff about administration and rules about how one agency should act or how some government official should behave or all of that stuff, which is public law, is really not law at all, right? It's just a series of administrative bylaws, right, for how the government should conduct itself, right? So when we honor law, what we should care about is private law. And then sort of he intends it slightly paradoxically, that the thing that is really for the general good is the private law, right? The public law is terrible. The public law is killing us, right? What we need is just private law, right? Not in the sense that it's you're isolated, but it's what governs the appropriate interactions among individuals and themselves. You know, I'm not going to probably get very far on this, but I'm going to see what I can do as I move along. You might think that Hayek believes that although spontaneous social order can't be the product of conscious reason, but instead should be the product of lots of individuals interacting in ways that adds up to the social order, but without anybody intending it, you might think that Hayek could still say, and he could, but he doesn't, the rules of just conduct, at least, are the product of conscious reason, right? But Hayek doesn't say that. Hayek says that would be a conceit of reason also, right? The idea that somebody, and I would put it in a way that I think makes it a bit plausible, the idea that somewhere some guy was sitting around, or a couple of people were sitting around, and they said, you know, and a world of law doesn't exist yet, right? And they say, you know, what we really need is a spontaneous social order. Well, what would we need in order to get a spontaneous social order? Well, how about these things called rules of just conduct, right? Well, what would they look like? Well, each of them would assign rights to people that are involved, right? Hey, that's a great idea, right? Let's have those things, right? Well, Hayek says, of course, that is crazy. Where do the rules of just conduct come from, right? At least in the sense of their actual behavioral existence in human. They also are the products of not the products of design. They also evolve. They also emerge. Primitive societies were already spontaneous to some extent, in the sense that they depended upon people having a sense, well, it's okay to act in this way to my neighbor, but it's not okay to act in this other way to my neighbor. Societies in which were replete with people who had this unarticulated sense, oh, this way of behaving is okay, but this other way of behaving is not okay. Those are the societies that survived. Those are the societies that were imitated, right? So more and more you have societies in which a significant number of people abide by something like these rules of just conduct. They think they really ought to behave in certain ways, but they've never actually said, hey, you know, there's a rule of behavior here that I'm committed to abiding by. The rules are not articulated. Okay? Certainly the rules are not a matter of legislation, and this is one of the key points. The rules of just conduct, and therefore the law, according to Hayek, long precedes any legislation. Right? The best that legislation can do, more or less, is to clarify, to come upon the scene afterwards, say, yeah, there seem to be these rules that people are following, and in ways that we don't fully comprehend, because people tend to follow these rules, society seems to be getting along pretty well. But people are a little confused about what some of these rules mean, or the rules may seem, in a few cases, to conflict. So what a good legislator does is he cleans that up a little bit, right? He may find some particular rule that has evolved for some reason, but is a sort of dead end. So he eliminates that rule. But one ought not to think that the basic rules of just conduct are the product, historically, of any type of explicit rational insight. Try to do something real quick now. The fact that the rules of just conduct have not historically emerged as the product of conscious reason doesn't mean that they can't be validated now by conscious reason, right? In fact, it sounds like we've been doing something like that. It sounds like we've been saying, hey, now that we have these rules, we can reflect on what good they do for us. Well, what they do is they help spontaneous order emerge, and spontaneous order is just swell for most of us, and so the rules must be justified. So it looks like after the fact, we can justify these rules of just conduct. I want to close by pointing out that things are unfortunately a bit more complicated than that. The argument I've just given is, I think, the best argument that Hayek can give if you press him and say, well, why are these rules justified? Okay? So the best argument that Hayek could give, although he doesn't, as far as I know, explicitly give it, is to say, look, I'm not going to get involved in this morality stuff. I'm not going to try to tell people what's right and wrong or good and bad. I just know that different people have whatever ends, whatever purposes they have, and I, through my great improved social science, am showing people that if they want to pursue their ends, their best bet is to live within a spontaneous order. If they want to live within a spontaneous order, their best bet is to have uncompromising allegiance to the rules of just conduct. Right? So there's a type of pragmatic instrumentalist justification for abiding by the rules. Two quick accounts of why there's a problem with this. First of all, there are all those people I talked about earlier who are the people that Steve Hicks talked about, right? These people have certain ultimate preferences, certain ultimate ends, and those ends are not going to be served by compliance with the rules of just conduct. For those people, you cannot go to those people. And remember I said, those are the people that Hayek tends to want to forget about. You can't go to those people and say, look, through my good social science, I've shown that a regime of strict compliance with the rules of just conduct is likely to get you material well-being, comfort, a pleasant vacation, financial security, which those people say, that is exactly what is contemptible. I don't want those rules. If you show me that that's what those rules get me, I have all the more reason to be against those rules. That's simple. Try to mention quickly what is actually a more complex matter. Hayek himself notices the following wrinkle. He says, in effect, you know, if you value freedom solely on a pragmatic or instrumental basis, you're not going to get the benefits of freedom. And the reason is, in Hayek anyway, is that if you value freedom on some sort of pragmatic or instrumental argument, what you're going to do whenever there's a question of, well, should I stick by freedom or should I allow a little violation of freedom, right? you're going to, in the actual world, you're going to tilt towards the violation of freedom. And the reason is that the benefits from the violation of freedom on a case-by-case basis will always be more vivid and immediate than the costs of violating the freedom. So for instance, or always, I should, often. So for instance, the issue is there's some horrible new recreational drug going around, right? And people use it and they do horrible things to themselves. And some legislator who is a devotee of freedom thinks, well, boy, I really like freedom. I think people should be allowed to buy and sell and ingest. But God, look at the pictures of these people drooling, and it's just horrible. The benefits of intervention, the benefits of a small infringement upon freedom are incredibly vivid and present and at least plausible, right? The immediate benefits, right? What are the benefits of sticking by freedom? They are unpredictable, right? The benefits of freedom are that somehow people are going to be free in the future to make various choices, the particular value of which we don't know because we don't know what those choices are going to be. So if you approach freedom and decide whether or not you're going to abide by it on this pragmatic or instrumental basis, which remember is the basis that I suggested that Hayek himself has to offer, right? Hayek himself has an argument to say, if you think of freedom in that way, freedom is lost. You only, Hayek says, get the blessing, you're only going to abide by freedom if you take freedom, almost an exact quote, if you take freedom as a supreme principle whose application to particular cases doesn't require justification. So freedom has to be thought of as a type of deep principle somehow derived from considerations of rights and justice, and unless we believe in freedom in that way, freedom is going to be undercut when we decide whether or not in particular cases are we going to abide by freedom or not. So the very way, the very attempt to justify freedom instrumentally, which we thought might be Hayek's best bet, Hayek himself shows, although he doesn't realize this, right, won't in fact justify freedom, but will undermine freedom. One of the conclusions, therefore, of Hayek's social science is that we need freedom as a supreme moral principle or among our supreme moral principles if in fact we are going to have allegiance to the rules of just conduct, and therefore in fact if we are going to be able to sustain society as a spontaneous order and benefit from it. That's a very important insight of Hayek's, but there's also an incredible irony here. Because what have we said? We've said that one of the great teachings of Hayek's social science is that absolutely crucial to sustaining the free society is the belief in certain deep moral principles. And of course, Hayek himself has said that's off the map. Yes, sir. That's great. There's incredible similarities. The contrast that many people know between what Spencer calls militant society versus industrial society is this contrast between a designed and a spontaneous. So what's really worth noting on top of that is that Hayek, who has these wonderful footnotes to everybody, right, and knows about everybody and has got to know about Spencer, has, as far as I know, no single positive, really positive footnote to Spencer in all of the work I know of. There is one sort of backhand positive, but it's on a very minor issue. So I believe that Hayek knew this great similarity to Spencer and thought that that was a cross he didn't want to bear because Spencer was in such disrepute. Some of you people may have had a similar experience with respect to it. Yeah.
It seems like this just won't work. Hayek, that is. The problem with this concept of this contrast between the concept of a spontaneous order, spontaneous order good, designed order bad, is that most of the bad things that we're against are themselves the product of what Hayek would have to call spontaneous order processes, as you sort of implied in your final comment. That is, nobody sat down and said, let's have a regulatory state according to the following plan. What we had instead was a set of simple rules for representative democracy, a bunch of individual voters and political entrepreneurs who, through a sort of invisible hand process, generated an unintentional result that has a certain kind of structure. So to say, you know, let's do whatever leads to spontaneous order without introducing any sort of normative considerations doesn't seem to cut it. I mean, the converse point is that I'm sure that business strategy at the highest levels inside Microsoft is not the product of spontaneous order of the free and unplanned and uncoordinated activities of all the different people working at Microsoft. I mean, there's a lot of design and a lot of planning going on there. So,
okay, a couple of things. One, I think your first point is correct, although to develop it fully, one would want to have a certain, make one thing clear, and that is not every unintended consequence is a spontaneous order, right? The set of unintended consequences have to have a certain sort of relationship of mutual support to one another in order for it to be a spontaneous order. But I still think the first point is fundamentally absolutely right. One of the things I left out of the discussion, right, which is in the text but not in my oral remarks, is that, of course, Hayek thinks there's plenty of room for organization in the world, right? Government is an organization, and government, not society, but government is the organization that has the purpose of sustaining the rules of just conduct, defining and supporting them. And firms are organizations, right? And there's nothing wrong with organizations as long as you don't think that society is one. Yes.
Yeah, I believe that Hayek's intention was rather to allow evolution to happen in the legal sphere, and as things evolve from personal habits into local customs, into morals, and then into law, that as similar to how if animals and plants do not evolve, they disappear.
Right.
Customs, habits, morals, and laws that will necessarily weed each other out as they progress into things that only tend to work. However, what he didn't see, or what he chose to ignore in developing and describing the system, is that this entire structure could be co-opted by the enemies of freedom and impose bad law. And that's what what I believe has actually happened.
Yes, yes. I think you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, Hayek, when he does this sort of history of law stuff, it's highly, highly selective, right? I mean, there's one place in the world where things evolved the way he wanted them to evolve, right? Which was England, you know, between 1200 and 1700. And that, right? So, I mean, that exactly makes, I think, the point that several people have made. Behind this, right, is an independent view, right, about what is desirable or just, right, or appropriate for human, but that any expression of that is suppressed, and he wants to portray it simply as a historical descriptive exercise. But in saying all this, I don't want people to get the idea that what I was talking about is not incredibly valuable. What's incredibly valuable is not his view about whether or not good stuff will inevitably evolve, right? But what's incredibly valuable are his insights into different ways in which people think about the nature of society, and ways in which some people's thought about the nature of society is profoundly mistaken, and also how mistaken ways of thinking about the nature of society lead you into mistaken ways of thinking about law that you really don't have to stick with, because there are other ways of thinking about social order, right? So think of him more as talking about what the possibilities are, rather than talking about, you know, at what direction we actually are evolving in. Yeah, of course.
Oh, thank you, Eric. Actually, thank you for this lecture. I really, really appreciate it. It's about time Hayek got some attention here in objectivist circles. And I think I'd like to draw you out in favor of, or on behalf of, Hayek a little bit more. Objectivism has suffered really badly for its lack of Hayek, or for its lack of appreciation for spontaneous order. I think Ayn Rand suffered very badly for that, and I think we can see it not only in her views on government, or objectivist views on government, but also in, for example, rationalistic constructivism, is what Hayek called it, which is the same kind of rational order imposed on the self or on the soul, the evolution of the individual. Okay. So I think that because of that, I think objectivism has some cultural antipathies towards Hayek's appreciation for spontaneous order. Yes. I think are coming from an aesthetic point of view. I was hoping you might comment on that, but I just don't see how somebody can appreciate spontaneous order fully and not recognize that the law, just governance, can bootstrap itself. In other words, objectivism still holds on behalf of legislature, still holds on behalf of squashing spontaneous order by imposing a government that has a monopoly. Yeah. And we just heard a second ago a question which I think again stemmed from this ignorance of the role of spontaneous order. In this case, it was ignorance of public choice and the mechanisms by which public choice, as soon as you squash spontaneous order by imposing this government with a monopoly, you squash the evolution of a rational legal order. And they're now attributing it to, I guess, anarchy, and thinking that government is the solution for that instead of the opposite conclusion, which I think Hayek would support. Am I drawing you out on that?
Let me try to comment, right, because you've made a lot of interesting points. Starting sort of toward the end, because initially you were talking about sort of being a rational constructionist with respect to somehow your own life, right? And then you went on to the sort of political issue. Obviously, the anarchism limited government thing is a complicated issue. I think you are right to say that Rand's very, very quick dismissal of the individual anarchist position reflects a failure to be receptive to how spontaneous orders of a certain sort could emerge. So I think that's right. When I was originally thinking about these talks, I had a very ambitious moment for a second, right? I realized it was too ambitious, right? Which was to try to say that Hayek has this view about how there's this rational constructivist perspective we have on the social order, and that this is mistaken, and that objectivists will tend not to be subject to that mistake, not because they go through Hayek's reasons, but because they quickly say, but nobody has a right to do that, right? And then I thought about saying, but not in the interpersonal case, but in the intrapersonal case, it seemed to me that one often has in the objectivist world, and if I'm wrong, great, and I'm not making this not an accusation, right? You have the idea that, well, it's not rational to plan society in this sort of rational constructivist way, but it is rational to plan one's life. Now, I'm not against being reasonable and making, but there seems to be an underappreciation of how things that one might have inherited in terms of habits or beliefs or relationships can be valuable, or how things may fit together well in one's life by way of great serendipity and not because of some sort of rational construction. So my ambition was to try to suggest that there might be an error of rational constructivism applied within one's own life, but I haven't worked that out. And there may have been other elements, but let's talk.
Yes, thank you.
That was good.